The candles were already lit when I pulled into the driveway. I could see them through the front window, amber flickers dancing against the curtains my late wife had picked out 17 years ago. My daughter had kept them. That detail used to warm me. Standing there in the November cold, watching my son-in-law raise a glass to the people seated around my daughter's dining table, it just made me feel like a stranger peering into someone else's life. I was 40 minutes late. My fault. I'd stopped at a pharmacy on Route 9 to pick up my blood pressure medication, and the line had been unreasonable for a Thursday evening. I'd texted my daughter twice. No response. I figured she was busy hosting. I was reaching for the doorbell when I heard him through the glass. My son-in-law's voice carried the way it always did, too loud for the room, shaped for an audience. Honestly, he was saying, and I could hear the grin in it. Thanksgiving was so much better without the old man hovering over everything. Here's hoping tonight's the same. Laughter. Some of it nervous, some of it not. I stood on the porch with my hand frozen 6 inches from the doorbell and listened to my daughter laugh at that. It wasn't a polite laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that means stop it, you're being awful. It was genuine, relaxed, like a woman who'd had a few glasses of wine and was finally free to be honest about something she'd been holding in. I put my hand back in my pocket. I stood there for another 30 seconds, which felt like a much longer unit of time. Then I walked back to my car, started the engine, and drove home. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a dramatic man. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, the last 19 of those as a senior investigator. My job was to sit across from people who had very good reasons to lie to me and figure out exactly where the money had gone. I am not easily rattled. I do not make decisions out of emotion if I can help it, and I have never in my life walked away from a problem. But there is a difference between walking away and retreating to a position where you can think clearly. That night, I did the latter. My son-in-law's name is Brandon. He is 38 years old, which makes him 11 years younger than my daughter, Caroline. They met at a fundraiser 4 years ago. He was working the event as a strategic partnerships coordinator for some nonprofit I'd never heard of, and Caroline had gone with a friend from work. She called me the next morning, which she hadn't done in years, just to tell me about this man she'd met who was different. I'd heard that before. Caroline had a pattern. She was drawn to men who presented well-good shoes, easy smile, the kind of vocabulary that sounds more impressive than it is. Her first marriage, which ended when she was 31, had been to a man like that. By the time they divorced, he'd cost her $40,000 in bad investments and a starter home she'd had to sell at a loss. I told myself Brandon was different because I wanted it to be true. Caroline was 41. She wanted a partner. She wanted the life she'd imagined. I am her father, and I loved her, and love sometimes makes you see what you want to see. Brandon was charming. I'll give him that. He remembered details: my college team, the town I grew up in, the name of my late wife. On our first real introduction, over dinner at a steakhouse he'd chosen, and I'd paid for, he asked me about my career with what seemed like genuine curiosity. 31 years tracking financial crime, he said, shaking his head slowly. That must have been fascinating. I bet you can smell a lie from 100 yards. I smiled and said something modest. What I didn't say was, yes, and I've been smelling something since we sat down. I couldn't place it then. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the signal is too faint to identify, and you file it away under, watch this one, and move on. That's what I did. I moved on. I watched Caroline light up around him in a way I hadn't seen in years, and I decided that my job was to support my daughter, not audit her boyfriend. They got engaged 14 months after they met. Married the following spring. I walked her down the aisle at a vineyard in Virginia, and Brandon shook my hand afterward and called me Dad for the first time, and I felt the particular mix of hope and unease that I suspect most fathers feel in that moment. The unease didn't go away, but for a long time it didn't have a name. It took me 3 years to understand what I was looking at. Brandon did not keep a steady job. This was something I'd noticed early, but explained away. He was between opportunities. He was building something. He was consulting. These are words that can mean real things or nothing at all, and for a long time I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Caroline was a senior project manager at a logistics firm, making good money. They weren't struggling visibly. The house was nice. They took vacations. It was the vacations that finally started to bother me, not because they were taking them, because of how they were taken. A week in Portugal, a long weekend in New Orleans, a 10-day trip to Japan that Caroline mentioned almost in passing, as if it were the kind of thing people just did. I knew what Caroline made. I'd helped her negotiate her first salary at that firm, 15 years ago, when she'd called me nervous and uncertain before an offer call. I knew, roughly, what she should have been able to afford. Japan was not in that budget. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my money. But I started paying closer attention. Brandon, I noticed, had a wallet that he used the way some men use a performance. Whenever we went to dinner, which I usually paid for, because he always seemed to realize at the last moment that he'd left the right card at home, he would take out his wallet and open it deliberately, displaying its contents the way a hand of cards gets fanned across a table. 3, sometimes 4 credit cards, different colors, different brands. He rotated which one he reached for, and the selection always seemed slightly theatrical, like he was choosing the right tool for a specific job. Once, when he stepped away from the table, I watched him leave the wallet open on the restaurant chair. I am not proud of what I did next, but I am not ashamed of it either. I looked. Old habit. You don't spend 3 decades reading financial behavior without your eyes going to information when it's sitting right in front of you. The cards were all premium. Rewards cards, travel cards, the kind that come with annual fees and high limits. All 4 of them, and I caught the detail in the 2 seconds I had, were in Brandon's name only. Not joint accounts. His. I picked up my water glass and thought about that. Caroline was paying for a life that was being financed, at least in part, on credit that she may not have known the full extent of. And Brandon, charming as he was, had never once in 4 years of dinners and holidays and long conversations mentioned money in any concrete way. He talked about opportunities. He talked about the market. He talked about the right moment. He never talked about numbers. That is a habit I recognize. In my experience, people who avoid numbers are either very bad at them or very good at hiding them. Brandon did not strike me as a man who was bad at math. The week after Thanksgiving, after the night on the porch, I called my daughter. She called me first, actually, at 11 in the morning on a Friday. "Dad, I'm so sorry about last night. We missed you. Why didn't you come in?" I told her the truth. I said I'd arrived and heard what Brandon said and decided it wasn't the right evening. There was a long pause. "He was joking," she said. "He says things like that. He doesn't mean it." "He's been saying things like that for 3 years, Caroline." Another pause. "You're being sensitive." I have been called many things over the course of my career. Methodical, relentless, occasionally, by people who didn't appreciate my findings, worse things than that. No one in 31 years had called me sensitive while trying to make me doubt my own perception. That particular technique, I knew from experience, is called minimization. It is what people do when they need you to stop paying attention. "Maybe," I said, "have dinner with me next week. Just the 2 of us." She agreed, and I could hear the relief in her voice, the relief of someone who expects the conversation to be over. It wasn't over. I did something before that dinner that I want to explain carefully, because I know how it sounds. I have a friend, I'll call him Gerald, because that's his name, and he doesn't mind, who spent 22 years as a credit analyst before retiring to consult privately. Gerald and I go back to a training program in 1987. He is discreet, he is thorough, and he knows how to find information that is technically public, but practically invisible to most people. I asked Gerald to look at Brandon's financial picture. Not to do anything illegal, not to access anything private, just to look at what was findable: public records, court filings, business registrations, anything that a determined person could locate through legitimate channels. Gerald called me back in 4 days. "Your son-in-law," Gerald said, "is a busy man." Brandon had incorporated 3 LLCs in the past 6 years. 2 were dissolved. The third was active, registered in Delaware, with a registered agent address and no visible business activity. One of the dissolved companies had been the subject of a civil complaint, a contractor who said he'd been hired for a project and never paid. The complaint had been settled, amount undisclosed. There were also 2 judgments. Small ones. In the scheme of things, one for $12,000, one for just under 9, both from credit card companies, both listed as satisfied, meaning he'd eventually paid, but the timeline suggested he'd let them go to judgment first, which is not what people do when they have money. The interesting part, Gerald said, is the most recent LLC. The most recent LLC, registered 8 months ago, listed Brandon as the managing member, but the business address, the actual physical address, not the registered agent, was my daughter's house. My daughter's house, which was in my daughter's name, which she had purchased before the marriage, and which remained, as far as I knew, her separate property. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. I sat in my kitchen for a while after that call. Then I made a few more. I have a personal attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my estate planning, my will, and the occasional contract review for the past 12 years. I trust her completely, which is a short list. I called her and explained the situation without editorializing, the way you learn to present facts when you've spent decades making cases. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is one of her better qualities. "The business address is the concerning part," she said when I finished. "If he's using her property as the registered address for an active LLC, without her explicit knowledge and consent, that could create liability exposure for her that she's not aware of." That's what I thought. Has she signed anything? Any documents related to his business activities? That's what I need to find out. "Be careful how you find out," Patricia said. "You need her to understand this on her own terms. If she feels cornered, she'll defend him." I knew that. I'd known that since the porch. This was not a situation I could approach head-on. My daughter was a grown woman who loved her husband, or at least had organized her life around him in the way that becomes indistinguishable from love after enough time. If I walked into dinner with a folder full of documents and said, "Your husband is using your house as cover for his business dealings and you might not know it," she would shut down. She would protect him. Not because she was weak, Caroline has never been weak, but because that is what we do when someone threatens the structure we've built our life inside. I had to show her, not tell her. The dinner was at a restaurant she liked, Italian place near her office. We ordered, and we talked about ordinary things for a while. Her work, my garden, the winter forecast. Caroline is good at surface conversation. She gets that from me, actually. After the pasta arrived, I said, "Tell me about Brandon's business." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "He mentioned a while back that he was working on something new." I didn't follow up at the time. "What's the venture?" What I had expected. Deflection, vagueness, the practiced non-answer of someone who doesn't actually know. What I got surprised me. Caroline set down her fork. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager. The look of someone who wants very badly to say something they've been carrying alone. "It's a real estate investment platform," she said. "He's been developing it for about a year. He has a developer and a marketing person, and he's been in conversations with some early investors." "Sounds promising," I said carefully. "He needs capital to get to the next stage." She picked up her fork again, but she wasn't eating. "He's asked me to help." "How much?" She looked at the table. "He wants to refinance the house." There it was. "The house you own," I said. "It would be a joint decision. We'd both be on the refinance." "But the equity is yours, Caroline. You bought that house before the marriage. That's your equity from your years of work." "I know that." Her voice had an edge now. "I'm not an idiot, Dad." "I know you're not. I've never thought you were. That's why I'm asking." She was quiet for a moment. "He says the returns would more than cover it." "He has projections." Projections. I have seen, in my career, literally thousands of financial projections. I have seen projections that turned out to be accurate, and projections that turned out to be fraudulent, and projections that were made by people who genuinely believed them and were simply wrong. The word projections in a pitch for an unproven platform, offered by a man with 2 satisfied judgments and 3 LLCs, 2 of which no longer existed, told me everything I needed to know about where this was going. "Can I see the projections?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'll ask him. Before you do anything with that house, Caroline, I'd like to see them." "Dad, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to let me look at the numbers before you make a decision. That's all." She nodded, slowly, and I could see her deciding something, whether to trust me. whether she still could. The projections arrived in my email 4 days later. Brandon had sent them directly, which I hadn't expected, a PDF titled Phase 2 Investment Overview, slickly formatted, full of graphs and market comparisons, and a revenue model that assumed, among other things, a user acquisition rate that would have been aggressive for a company with an established brand and a 9-figure marketing budget. I went through it the way I go through everything, line by line, checking the assumptions, following the math. It took me 2 hours. The short version, the numbers didn't work. The user acquisition assumption was the most visible problem. It was roughly 4 times what comparable platforms had achieved at the same stage, with no explanation for why this platform would perform differently. The expense projections were also optimistic to the point of fantasy, assuming a developer and a marketing team working at rates well below market for an extended period with no equity compensation. But the detail that stopped me, the detail I had to read 3 times to make sure I was seeing correctly, was a line item in the operating costs section, labeled Management Consulting Phase 2. The amount was $48,000 per quarter. The provider was listed as a company name I recognized immediately. It was the Active LLC, the one registered to my daughter's address, the one with Brandon as the sole managing member. He was planning to pay himself a consulting fee from the investment that my daughter would fund by refinancing her home through a company he owned, registered to her address, without, as far as I knew, her knowledge. The money would leave the investment vehicle, pass through his LLC, and land in his personal accounts. On paper, it would look like a legitimate business expense. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Patricia again. "You need to tell her," Patricia said. "All of it. The LLC, the address, the fee structure, the judgments. You have to give her the complete picture. She may not believe me. She may not. But you have to tell her. If you don't, and this goes forward, and she loses that house, you'll have known and said nothing." That was the right call. I knew it before she said it. I called Caroline and asked her to come to my house the following Saturday. Not a restaurant, not neutral territory. My house, where she'd grown up, where her mother's curtains still hung in the living room. I wanted her to be somewhere that reminded her of who she was before Brandon. That's a calculation, I know. But I'd stopped apologizing for being thorough. She arrived at 10 in the morning. I had coffee made. I had printed copies of Gerald's findings, the LLC registration, the judgment records, and the projections document with 3 pages of my own annotations. I did not put them on the table right away. I said, "I love you. I want you to hear everything I'm about to say through that lens." She looked at the papers. She looked at me. "What is this? Please sit down." She sat. I talked. I started from the beginning, not from the porch at Thanksgiving, but from the wallet at dinner 3 years ago, the thing I'd noticed and filed away. I told her about Gerald. I told her what Gerald had found. I told her about the LLCs, the judgments, the registered address. I told her about the projections and what was wrong with them, specifically with the math, in terms she could follow because she is an intelligent woman and deserved precision rather than vague alarm. And then I slid the annotated projections across the table and let her see the management consulting line item. She stared at it for a long time. "He registered that company to my address," she said finally. "Yes, without asking me. That's what the records show." She turned the page. She looked at my annotations. She turned another page. She is, I remembered, someone who once stayed up until 2 in the morning as a 16-year-old to find a $14 error in her school fundraising spreadsheet. She has always been precise when she wanted to be. "This number," she said, pointing to the user acquisition assumption, "this is impossible." "Yes, this is 4 times what any comparable—" "Yes." She closed the document. She didn't cry. Caroline is not a crier, which she also gets from me. She sat very still, which is what she does when she's processing something difficult, and I waited, because that's what the moment required. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I've suspected for about 2 years. I've had documentation for 2 weeks. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It was a fair question. I'd asked myself the same one. Because I needed to be certain, and because I needed you to be ready to hear it. "You don't think I could have handled it before now?" "I think you would have defended him. I think you might still." She looked at me then with an expression that was complicated and tired, and something I can only describe as the face of someone watching an illusion dissolve. It's not a happy face, but it's an honest one. He asked me to sign the refinance documents next week, she said. I know. I almost did. I was going to. I'd already called the bank. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, the way I used to when she was small and frightened of something. I know, I said again. I won't tell you that everything resolved cleanly, because that's not how real situations resolve. What I'll tell you is what happened in the months that followed, in the order it happened, because I think the order matters. Caroline did not sign the refinance documents. She confronted Brandon with what I'd shown her. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I don't know exactly what was said, but I know it lasted 3 hours and ended with Brandon sleeping in the guest room. Over the following 2 weeks, Caroline hired her own attorney, a recommendation from Patricia, and began requesting documentation from Brandon about his business finances, his personal finances, his credit accounts. He provided some of it. What he provided confirmed what Gerald had found and added 2 credit cards Caroline had not known about, with a combined balance of just over $61,000. She also discovered, through her attorney, that the LLC registered to her home address had listed her property in a document submitted to a potential investor, listed it as an asset of the managing partner in a context that implied Brandon had ownership interest in it. He did not have ownership interest in it. He had never had ownership interest in it. He had represented her separate property as his own to attract investment. That detail, more than any other, was what made Caroline stop defending him. I will not describe the end of their marriage in detail, because that is her story to tell, not mine. I will say only this. She is living in her house. It is still hers. She did not refinance it. The LLC has been dissolved. Brandon moved to an apartment in the city, and as far as I know, he is developing his real estate investment platform with someone else's money, if he's found it. Caroline came to dinner at my house a few weeks ago. She brought a bottle of wine and a pie she'd made herself, which she hasn't done since her mother was alive. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, I should have listened to you sooner. I shook my head. You listened when it mattered. You knew. You knew for years. I had a feeling for years. There's a difference. I poured more wine. Your mother used to say that the facts don't care about your feelings, but your feelings can sometimes point you to the facts. She was right about most things. Caroline smiled. It was a real smile, not a performed one. She looked tired and a little raw, the way people look when they've been through something hard and come out the other side still standing. I thought she looked more like herself than she had in 4 years. What made you finally look into him? She asked. Was it Thanksgiving? No, I said. It was the wallet. What wallet? At the steakhouse. The first time I really met him, he left his wallet open on the chair. She stared at me. And you looked. Old habit. She laughed, a real one, the kind she gets from her mother, and shook her head slowly. You couldn't have just told me that night? Would you have believed me? She thought about that. No, she said finally. Probably not. That's why I waited. We finished the wine. We talked about other things, her job, my garden, the holidays coming up. Before she left, she stood in the doorway, the way she always does, one hand on the frame, doing that last check she's done since childhood to make sure she hasn't forgotten anything. Dad, she said. Yeah, thank you for not letting it go. I watched her walk to her car. I stood in the doorway until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside, washed the glasses, and went to bed. Some things you carry for years before you can finally set them down. The trick is knowing the difference between patience and avoidance, knowing when waiting is wisdom, and when it's just fear dressed up to look like strategy. I got lucky, or I got careful. In my experience, those two things are harder to tell apart than most people think, but I'll take it.